So let me move on to a harder one for us as members of Christian faith community. Is there a role for the United Church working with other faiths to speak out against what seems a rising wave of intolerance and continuing systemic racism, including expressions of hate in our country? Multiculturalism has been an international recognized characteristic of Canada for decades, maybe half a century. And so the expressions of hate are disturbing, and how we counter them. So there you are. An easy question.
That's simple. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I mean, so I think the first place that I would think about in terms of rising divisions and hatred in our society is like we have to look under our own hood, right? Like that those political, especially a lot of it starts around political division and class division. And the 1996 Nobel laureate in economics was a university professor, and like by the traditional like university professor, in that he was so educated he could teach in any faculty, named Amartya Sen, who is a Bangladeshi economist, but also has written a lot about justice and written a lot in the discipline of philosophy. And his book that he wrote with his Nobel Prize is called Development as Freedom. And he talks in this book about his experience of growing up in Bangladesh and the class and religious riots that happened after partition, and the ways in which people could or couldn't be employed based on their religion. And it really profoundly shaped his worldview. And he came to realize, and what he argued in his work that won him the Nobel Prize, is that all of our freedoms are connected to each other, but conversely, all of our unfreedoms are connected to each other. And so if you experience economic unfreedom, you're more likely to also experience political unfreedom or physical unfreedom or spiritual unfreedom, and vice versa. And so, you know, it on the one hand, it's disturbing. On the other hand, it's not surprising to me in this sort of like end stage neo-mercantilist capitalism that we are seeing these kinds of divides. I think that our push for equity, diversity, and anti-racism is ignoring a huge reality of white poverty in North America and in Europe that's causing it's causing sort of entrenched views of, you're seeing the shadow side of 500 years of Euro-Christian colonization that has taught people, at the very least, at least you're white. So when being poor and white was still better than being a person of color, has been the message that has been socialized into a huge part of societies, that and this is not limited to North America and to Europe, because of course colonization has impacted the rest of the world in really profound ways. And that idea, like that very core of white supremacy, and this, you know, primarily British, but also other European traditions have what they call like taxonomies of race, right? So we tried to categorize, to uphold the monarchist and mercantilist systems about who had the most value in society. And I'm talking like hundreds of years ago. All of that's been enculturated into how the economy works, who has access to power. And I think unless we acknowledge, we try to often like fight difference with facts. And facts are not what moves people, right? It's our human stories. And so there was a TV show by she's a Jewish American comedian, Sarah Silverman. She's really raunchy and outrageous. I don't suggest you just like look at her stand up, but she did this TV show called Why I Love America or something like that. And so she decided at the rise of the Tea Party and like sort of as a precursor to the MAGA movement in the US, that she was going to go and get to know her neighbors. And so she went like deep into the heart of the American South as like a woman Jewish comedian from LA, and So, she went and talked to this like ultra Tea Party, white conservative, racist family in the bayou in Louisiana, and just got to know them. And like by the end of it, they were hugging, and they saw the humanity in her. She learned a lot about their lives and like confronted some of the assumptions that she had about them. And she did this over and over again in her show, trying to like build bridges with the people where she had the most difference. And I think that the thing for me that is most painful about the United Church of Canada is that we have to walk this like fine line between the values that we say that we have around openness and diversity and inclusion, and creating culture, like creating safety for people who have traditionally been marginalized based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, on their race. People who have experienced marginalizations deserve the right to be able to worship in a safe space and to be part of a Christian community in a safe space. And that without some of the tension of people who maybe grew up with a more restrictive view or not really understanding the ways in which their lives have contributed to the unsafety of somebody else and are struggling with that, or are struggling with like traditional biblical interpretations of sexual orientation and gender identity, and are going to say things that are hurtful or exclusive. And our tendency in the church has been to sort of like cast away those people who are not there yet. And I think that's a really hard thing, because it doesn't help them to get to maybe where the church, like those on the more progressive or inclusive side of the church, are leading us and always pulling us to. It's almost like we sort of throw up our hands and in frustration and say like, oh, well, somebody got hurt, and so now we have to double down on like making sure that never happens again. And the truth is, like, we're fallible human beings. We are gonna hurt each other. I think we need to be speaking out against hate. I think, when we have segments of society that are showing up with the Proud Boys at like a drag show, or drag queens reading at libraries and things like that, which, how fun. For United Church people and other people of faith that share the same consciousness and openness to show up and to say, like, not in our names, like, don't use Christianity in our names, and that we and to show our presence as having a different belief system around places where there's division, but also, and this is the hard part, is like being able to talk to our neighbors and find out, why are you so entrenched and positional? Like, what is hurting you that you have to fight against these other issues so strongly? And in the US, I think it's especially white poverty. And I think that is starting to show here. I've my whole adult life, I've sort of bounced between Canada and the US. I became an American citizen because I recognized my J-tree rights to see the border as irrelevant to Indigenous people. Canada's, in my experience, only ever been about 15 years behind the US. And so, if you watch what's happening in the US in terms of the rise of hatred, which is significantly more than here, I think unless we find ways to bridge some divides, like, that's going to get worse. But I think the primary driver of it right now is economic inequality and a lot of lateral violence that's coming from the fact that the majority of the world's wealth is going to the 1% of the 1%. All you have to do is watch Question Period around, like, the CEO of Loblaws, like, saying straight up that there's been no profiteering since the pandemic, and that they have to be able to have a not go into a deficit, but they're making billions of dollars in profit, and he's getting multi-million-dollar bonuses. So, like, both things are not true. Yeah. It's not an easy question, but I think that there's also, I don't see it so much, maybe a little bit with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Canada and the rise of anti-Asian hate. Like, I don't think that those conversations are not important, but I actually think that it's more that we have to have community conversations. And because I don't think that the people who are perpetrating the most hate are people who are, it's not a religious conflict that's happening so much. And we need to stand with our Muslim and Jewish Christians, sisters and brothers, and siblings when they're experiencing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So that's for me a secondary concern. I think the bigger divides that we're seeing are from our economic system failing, or actually functioning according to design.
Thank you for that answer. It's very complicated. Not an easy question, but a good answer.